I'm the Managing Director of Accountability and Authorizer Supports for SchoolWorks. For those of you who are not familiar with SchoolWorks, we're an education consulting organization, and we specialize in evidence-based program evaluation, planning, intervention support, and monitoring. And so we've worked with and supported the work of authorizers for over 20 years. We help them to ensure that the quality of their schools in their portfolio is high. We partner with them to help them to effectively and consistently fulfill their role as an authorizer. So just really honored to have this opportunity with so many of you. I see there are 45 folks who've joined in today and taken some time. And this is a great opportunity. So let me just move on. So basically what brought us together today is the pandemic is leading to closures, many into May and some through the end of the school year. This is not new news. However, many authorizers that we talk to are identifying that they're challenged to accumulate the evidence that they need to do their regular oversight. So at SchoolWorks, basically we call this the cycle of effective authorizing. And I'm only sharing this just to kind of level set what it is we're talking about today. So typically you start with authorization, new school application, you go into contracting, then oversight of the contract, potentially corrective action, but ultimately to renewal, which circles back through the cycle. Today's conversation is focused on oversight. So we are thinking about this time in the contract, operational schools, how authorizers are adjusting what it is they're trying to do to collect the evidence for oversight. We are planning to have a conversation next week, probably in the afternoon on Monday, and we'll focus more on renewal, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. But really today, we have an opportunity for authorizers to share how they're retooling and adjusting their oversight to reflect these current situations. So it's really that. So we're lucky enough to have three great panelists who I've had the opportunity to do a fair amount of work with, and some of you may know them. Peng Chao, who's the Executive Director for School District of Philly's Charter Schools Office. Tess Stovall is the Director of Charter Schools for the Tennessee State Board of Education, and Jason Sarsfield, who's the Deputy Director at the Center for Charter Schools at Central Michigan University. Jason, I think, is having some audio issues, so hopefully we'll be able to hear from him, and it's not my way of keeping him off the call. But before we move into this conversation a little bit more, we'd actually like to poll all of you and find out where you all are. So Jen, are you able to release that survey? I think we'll put it up for about 30 seconds and let everybody respond to this. So basically, how is your evidence compromised and in what areas? If you can take a second to answer these three questions, we'll share the results just in 20 or 30 seconds with everybody to kick off our conversation. Okay, so we've heard from about 15 of you. Those of you who haven't yet, please take a second and answer those questions. Give you another 10 seconds or so. All right, last call for votes here. All right. Jen, oh, there we go. Share the results. Tess, Peng, are you able to see the results on your screen?
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
So it looks like nearly everybody, their evidence is compromised within academic, not so much in financial, and a mixed bag when it comes to operational evidence. So what I'd like to do is actually move folks over to this. Close that out. And let's see, Tess, I think we'll start with you and then go to Peng. But generally, how has the State Board of Ed in Tennessee adjusted your oversight? Maybe start with the number of schools in your portfolio and then talk a little bit about what you've done in the short term.
Sure. So the State Board of Education, we have a small portfolio. So we have 3 schools. We have 2 located here in Nashville, which is where I'm located, and then 1 in Memphis. We cover all grade spans. So we have an elementary, a middle, and a high school. So for us, we have spent the last week and a half really focused, I think, more on the direct needs of schools, which I think has been to a certain extent blurring the autonomy lines just a little bit, because we recognize that this is to a certain extent a crisis situation and we need to be more hands-on with our schools and supporting their needs than maybe in a typical cadence or setting. I think, for us, when we think about beyond the academic data, which clearly most of us are in the midst of trying to think through what does our performance framework look like, we're really thinking about how do we use the qualitative data that we collected on our annual site visits, which we were actually able to wrap up before all the schools closed down, to really provide feedback to schools going into the next school year. And so as we're thinking about in our end of year meetings over the summer, I think instead of using academic data, which has primarily been the driver of those conversations, we're thinking about how are we using the more of the qualitative data via our operational framework, as well as the site visit evidence collected, in order to drive any feedback conversations with our schools.
All right. Thanks, Tess. Thanks for kicking us off. Peng, maybe the same, portfolio size and some of the adjustments you've made in the short term.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm in the authorizing office at the School District of Philadelphia, where we have 87 brick and mortar charter schools across all grades and across all of our neighborhoods here in Philadelphia. Similar to what Tess said, our team very much understands our role as the authorizer, and up until March, we were really disciplined about staying in that lane. But once we realized that we were about to enter a situation that would be so far from anything that anyone had ever imagined or even planned for, we made a really conscious decision there in early March to pivot quite a bit from oversight into just supporting schools and making sure that we understood their needs and could help fill that gap as quickly as possible. So as the district-based authorizer, we have access to the state and the city in ways that 87 individual schools don't, and it wouldn't have been effective or efficient for them to have done that. So for the past couple of weeks, we've really pivoted away from oversight into just really trying to figure out how we can help our schools support all of our students. I think now we're starting to pivot back into the oversight space while still trying to figure out what gaps exist, and if we can, we'll fill those gaps. We are trying to get a better sense for what data are available, especially in the academic space, if any. And actually on Friday, the state passed new legislation that actually calls for us to support schools and kind of provide oversight over their continuity of education plans at the same time. And so we're trying to figure out what that looks like in the coming weeks, but also what that means for a school over the course of its term.
Cool. Thank you, Peng. Jason, I think you're connected to audio. Can you just say hey if you are?
Hey, can you hear me?
We can, great. If you're able to turn on your video, it'd be great to see you as well, but if you can't, that's understandable. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about CMU, portfolio size, and some short-term adjustments you've made to your oversight.
Sure, and I've gotten 2 requests from you to share my camera. I've accepted both of them, and so not sure. I've been having some challenges, but at least, and I can continue to work on it, but good afternoon, everyone. Jason Sarsfield at Central Michigan University. Before I begin, I just also see lots of friendly faces on the participant list, so it's good to be with you all, and also thinking of everybody and the challenges you face, not just with your schools, but as the crisis hits all of us personally as well. So start with that. We are a statewide university authorizer. We've been at this work for 25 years in Michigan. We authorize 57 schools across the state serving 28,000 students. As a university authorizer in Michigan, we benefit from significant autonomy. And what I mean by that is we have our own performance frameworks, and the Michigan Department of Education has very little authority over us. And so we can act a little bit more nimbly. I'd like to piggyback on Tess and Peng's comments as we have a similar situation in both regards. One is, our state has been granted the assessment waiver. We also mandate the NWEA map. We've canceled that for the year, so clearly there's a big gap in achievement and growth data and comparative data that comes with that. We, like many others, and as Tess had indicated, are likely going to be focusing more on qualitative evidence as we approach the next renewal class, and adapting some of our protocols as a result of that to focus a little more heavily on that. May engage groups like SchoolWorks, who are doing a great job in that space, to help support that work. On the finance and operational sides, much like everyone else, very little changes as of yet. We are still waiting at any moment now over the next day or two to get word from our governor and State Department of Ed. We're likely to be asked to approve and monitor the learning continuity plans as Peng had kind of illuminated in Philadelphia. So there's some unknown at what that might mean. We're kind of proactively ramping up to exercise that role, but again, waiting on the state for specific direction on doing that. We also, particularly at this time, feel that while we have an oversight responsibility, we also have a responsibility to support our schools, and that starts really with listening to their challenges and responding to the extent we can. And so we're utilizing a number of strategies to do that. And I know I kind of jumped around a little bit, particularly around some of the things we've stopped doing. And I know that's another question, Dave, but one of the first things we did before the state announced their discontinuing the state test this year was to reassure our schools that we wouldn't be moving forward with our NWA mandated assessments for the spring.
Just a quick question to the three of you. Are you able, or are you receiving anything in terms of evidence? So an example of that I think of are boards. Each state has different rules regarding virtual board meetings. For open meeting law, I know in Minnesota, there's actually a pandemic exemption for being in person. And so the board I'm on, I'm able to actually meet in a Zoom environment. We did last week. Are any of you able to collect any evidence, financial, operational, or academic?
Yeah, so
I was going to say quickly, I will just say that for me, Tess, our focus on the evidence has, and I would say our most pressing focus on the oversight has been around special populations. So recognizing that some of the timelines have been extended, particularly around students with disabilities and IEPs, but that is an oversight that, number one, we're still collecting and making sure that schools are providing those appropriate services and meeting those appropriate deadlines.
Mm-hmm. Jason, thanks.
Yeah, so our governor has issued, much like Minnesota, a special order suspending some of the Open Meetings Act laws so that our boards have been able to meet virtually. Many of them are doing that. Our field representatives are joining those meetings virtually and staying connected. We've provided a significant amount of information and support for our boards in interpreting the governor's actions. And so that's actually been going quite well for the schools that have decided to continue to meet in the short term. Some boards have canceled or postponed meetings indefinitely, but we've been able to collect the same types of qualitative evidence on board activity and then the follow-up around board minutes and those kinds of things. So again, operationally, we've adjusted some dates, but we still have an ability to collect kind of the compliance information as needed and as appropriate depending on the current context.
Peng, anything to add that's different or nuanced?
Yeah, I mean, we remain optimistic that we can still collect the whole list of things that we look at annually for finances and organizational compliance. I think we can still get there. Obviously, there might be some resetting of standards that has to happen after the fact, and we'll figure that out when we get there. And I think, on the board front, business still has to get done, and the state has adjusted its meetings approach towards open meetings so that boards can still do what they need to do, especially now that we see a lot of schools making some investments in technology that they didn't plan for and making some kind of contract and staffing changes as well.
Okay, thanks. Well, Jason and Peng, you both talked about continuity of learning plans. I know that people call them different things like distance learning plans or online learning plans. I'm curious, each of you, and we'll start with Tess since we haven't heard about it, but are schools creating the plans? Have you reviewed them? And how do you plan to hold the schools accountable to those plans if you have a role in that? Tess?
Sure. So from a statewide perspective, there has been no expectation that learning plans are developed either at the charter school level or at the district level. That is a local decision, and we're seeing either across the state, districts are taking a wide variety of approaches, from providing resources to providing online classes. So that is left up to the district's decision. In our case, we too are leaving that up to our charter schools, but we have asked them to provide us a plan of what is their short-term and long-term plan. So in Tennessee, at a minimum, schools are going to be closed until April the 23rd. We do expect that to go longer, but we've said, please tell us what is your plan over the next 3 weeks, and then what is your plan should the closure extend longer. In particular, we are looking for, are you having any formalized instruction? Are there going to be any grades? Are students required to participate? Because that then will cascade a series of additional questions about how are we ensuring that all students have access to those materials? How are we supporting our students with disabilities or our English learners? How are we providing that required differentiation? So for us, it's really understanding what is the school's plan and what is required, and how are we holding, if at all, students accountable so that we can then be supporting them in remaining in compliance during this distance learning.
Okay, thanks. Peng, if you want to go next about the plans you've seen.
Yeah, there are some huge questions here across the state, and definitely here in Philadelphia, about what can be required of students and therefore of schools in terms of grades, attendance, credits, promotion, or retention, especially as we get closer to the end of the year and those questions become really front and center. And so we're trying to, kind of absent clear guidance from the state, trying to develop our own approach towards kind of the spectrum of services, from full-blown, this is a real school day and everything is required, to enrichment and review, where there might be a learning packet that's sent home kind of on a get done what you can get done basis. We're trying to define as much as we can with the state's help so that schools understand where they should kind of direct their plans moving forward. And again, we're collecting all the plans, and so if we see equity issues, if we see that a school is requiring all students to do something online, but they haven't already guaranteed that the student has access to the device and to the internet, then we're going to call that out, we're going to scrutinize it, and we're going to make sure that that plan's either changed or that the resources are presented to the student. So lots of questions around how these continuity of education plans will actually be developed and implemented.
Before we go to Jason, Peng, just very specifically to that, how are you able to monitor that? Like, in a very, very fundamental sense, like if I'm a school and I have this plan, have you allocated your office like to different schools? Like they're each tasked for 3 or 4 or 10 different schools to monitor? And then what does that monitoring look like?
Yeah, so right now the submission requirement that we have out to schools is pretty brief and pretty high level. One, because we wanted to get a quick kind of at a glance look at the sector and to get a sense for what they're thinking about, and also because a lot of schools don't have fully fleshed out plans. So right now we have essentially a survey out to schools, and so we can pretty quickly on our end flag any potential issues, connect schools that are thinking about doing the same thing, or a school that has kind of a further evolved plan that we can connect another school with. So right now it's less monitoring and really making sure that at least on the front end, the proposals are in the right spot. In terms of ongoing monitoring, it's going to be tough. I mean, we are used to having brick and mortar charter schools that we can physically go into, physically meet with, have ongoing conversations with, students included. And so we're kind of pivoting into this cyber authorizing space almost, where we're less familiar and we have to figure out what a reasonable level of ongoing monitoring looks like.
Okay, thanks. Jason?
Yeah, more of the same. Really a lot of uncertainty. At the early days, the first couple of days of the school closure period, there was even some question on whether or not schools could provide any instruction, and that was quickly clarified. And we see and have collected evidence informally thus far, and really see a broad range of some schools being more equipped to institute some of these distance learning plans, some, providing instructional packets, even on school bus routes, for example, initially when they were doing food drops. So a real range, and we've tried to, really keep our schools informed to the extent that we can, even around some Title I types of flexibility around spending some of those funds on devices for teachers and students and things of that nature, but haven't really begun to formalize any oversight pending, word from the state around expectations. What we're anticipating in Michigan is that the intermediate school districts will provide oversight and support of the traditional school district plans, and that the authorizers will do so for the charter schools. It's yet to be seen formally, but we are actively ramping up for that. In anticipation of that, we have an academic performance and accountability team, half a dozen or so folks who will each be taking a kind of a small portfolio of each of our schools, have already begun to reach out to them to see what they're doing, what they might need some support on doing. And so really a wait and see and do what we can while we wait type of approach. Yeah,
some of the plans that we've seen from across the country that have kind of come across our desks, we have been like, we're not in a monitoring mode, but we just see them as part of our, the quality of the plans vary dramatically. And I've heard each of you use the word support in ways that typically authorizers are not using the word support. And so it's interesting. I hear you all saying that, it's almost formative through this process to help them get there. And you're kind of bending some of those principles of autonomy and independence of the charter schools in order to help them get through this place. Is anybody experiencing that a little bit differently? Like, have you taken a principled approach not to kind of dip into that autonomy, or have you consciously moved into support?
I think from a Tennessee perspective, we've consciously dipped into support. I think one thing that we've talked around a little bit, but I think that we have done very consciously is make sure that we're providing very accurate communication specifically to our charters. I think a lot of the communication that's coming from our State Department of Education is directed towards districts, which I completely understand. But we've seen a little bit of a missing communication link to our charter schools and how do they fit into the bigger picture around what's going on. And so we are trying to be providing as frequent communication about what's going on and what's applicable to the charter schools, what's not. In our state context, our charter schools are not their own LEAs, they're under the LEA of their district. So directing them to connect with their district office when they need to. And so really just making sure that we are ensuring that they're getting the communication that's coming down from our state department to our districts in a more, I think, more frequent fashion than we typically do.
This is Jason. Dave, I'd add that, we don't believe that providing support infringes upon autonomy in and of itself. They don't have to follow or take us up on our offer of support. And so just a little bit of a nuance there. We think you can have the best of both worlds, and we've made an adjustment over the last couple of years to be more actively supportive of the schools we authorize, understanding that there always is that kind of dilemma around where the role remains. I see a question here, and I want to jump ahead actually to cyber schools. We have a couple of, only a few cyber schools. We're not doing anything different with them, but I think we can learn something from our oversight of them. For example, when we do a site visit to a cyber school, we've developed protocols around taking a look at synchronous and asynchronous instruction online and viewing that and having protocols to assess that from a qualitative standpoint. And I think those tools might actually become helpful as we get more online learning. The other very interesting predicament is we have gotten a number of requests for immediate enrollment increases for our cyber schools as many parents look for immediate options to get their kids enrolled potentially in a cyber school. So there's a little bit of a give and take there about would we approve that enrollment increase outside of this crisis? And if so, do we do the same within the crisis? So it has created some unique oversight and, approval types of dilemmas.
So what you're saying are like material changes to your contract, which has a max of number of seats or students that they can serve. They're making requests for those online schools to actually increase the cap or the total number of students. Is that what you're saying, Jason?
That's correct. And we've gone in both ways. We've said that is a really sound request that's backed up with a real plan to take on more kids, and we've granted it. And then we've also not granted a request for the opposite types of reasons. But we've had to do that fairly quickly and, adjust our timelines and whatnot because we want to be responsive, but we also want to be responsible.
Right. Peng, I want to kind of direct one of these questions in the chat to you. And then I think there's one overall question that I'd like all three of you to respond before we go into questions from folks who are participating. But Peng, Robin in Missouri identified like what line of support won't you cross? It's not necessarily directed to you, but this idea of, you're looking at support. And I know that you all have taken a different approach than CMU in terms of what you will or won't do. Neither is right or wrong. It's just different support or different positions for it. But are there lines that you won't cross that you're making clear to your charter schools right now?
Yeah, I think we're supporting, not directing. We very much still respect schools' autonomy. We very much still respect individual school leadership teams and their boards making decisions on behalf of their students. They still know them best. We are deferential there still. I think, so we're not going to tell a school that we think they should be super hands-on and have this really robust online learning plan if that's not what they think is going to work for them and that's not what, frankly, they want to do. Similarly, on the other end of the spectrum, I think if a school's best faith effort is a learning packet that they send home once every other week, and that's kind of what they think is going to work for their kids, we're going to find a way to help them out with that and just kind of let that be the way that they want to support their kids. And I think we're going to let the schools kind of drive instruction in the way that they want to do it, just like they've always done it, and then be there if they need a connection or a resource.
Okay, thank you. Kind of the last question for all three of you before we go into these. Tess, you were talking about students on IEPs and English learners, and I think you said extending timelines. This certainly is a huge challenge that all of you are facing. I mean, not only oversight generally to the general education, but very specifically fulfilling all of those legally required aspects. So maybe Tess, you can start us off a little bit more about how you're extending timelines and what level of, I guess, confidence you have in kind of holding your schools accountable to fulfilling the specifically IEPs and or English language supports.
Sure. So I will say the extension of timelines and we're kind of feeding off of the guidance that we're getting from our state Department of Education. We actually, the call previous to this was a call by the Department of Education specifically to special education directors, answering questions such as how do we get signatures from parents? How do we hold virtual IEP meetings? So we are connecting directly with our special education and English learner directors to be, number one, providing that guidance that we are getting from the Department of Education in the state, knowing that it is evolving. And I have relative confidence that we're going to be able to meet the deadlines that we ask of our schools. And if we're not, we're asking our schools to document why not. So no response is not acceptable, but if you're not able to hold an IEP meeting because a parent wasn't able to meet virtually, we need to understand that you need to document that in the IEP, or you need to document that in the individual learning plan. So for us, we're really emphasizing first documentation of everything that's happening at the school level as it relates to these students. And then we're just going to continue to evolve with the guidance as it evolves from our department.
Okay. Jason, you want to take that one next? How are you all adjusting to IEP and EL oversight?
Yeah, so here in Michigan, the primary oversight for those special populations is vested in the state education department, and then they delegate much of that to the intermediate school districts. We also do oversight in addition to that and more actively. So right now, it's mainly been by providing information around federal and state guidance around these populations. We do regular site visits specific to special education throughout the school year for most of our schools. So we're obviously unable to do that right now, but we are very active in collaborating with and partnering with the special ed department at the state ed department, and we'll be integrating components for those special populations into our oversights of the continuity plans once that guidance is clear. But I think that also reiterates something that's been very important and valuable for us, and it goes without saying, which is I'd strongly recommend everyone to continue to stay very active with your partners around policy, and to the extent you can, inform policy, influence policy, as this is all a fluid situation, and each authorizer is a little different in terms of their role and relationships with the policy makers. We've been active directly with legislators, our state associations, and been extremely active in trying to influence state policy so that charters aren't put into a box unintentionally and have the flexibility to meet their student needs, particularly in these special student populations.
All right, thanks. Peng, anything to add?
Just one quick thing that the state did or enacted on Friday is that students as of March 13th, whatever their status was, if they had an IEP, if they were enrolled at a school, we're going to hold payments constant for as long as schools are ordered to be closed. So that is, if you had an IEP on March 13th, you have no reason to not be serving the student because you're still getting paid at the elevated rate. And then kind of on the continuity of education plan side, we are fully expecting schools to respond with how they're going to continue to accommodate for students with IEPs and English learners, as well as students in other kind of subgroups such as students experiencing homelessness and transitional housing, which are really important for us to look at as well.
And have you proactively broadcast those expectations to school leaders?
We've definitely pushed out kind of through our standard communications what regulations still hold, what requirements still exist. And so that much hopefully is clear to all of the schools.
Oh. All right, thanks. I'm going to go to a couple questions. Dana asked if anybody on the panel has, in their states or their local situations, seen a need or an opportunity to access additional funding to support remote learning. So basically, are there additional funds that either were set aside or have emerged in the short term to help schools get things like computers or internet support? I know, Peng, you and I talked about this before, so maybe you can start with your answer.
Yeah, this has really been kind of a point of pride here in Philadelphia in terms of a historically potentially divisive relationship between charter schools and the traditional district schools and the funding base that exists here in Philadelphia. I think in the past week or so, there have been really strong conversations in a spirit of partnership towards putting the funding base together to acquire lots of devices for students across the city and across all school types, including our Catholic schools and other private schools in the city. And so we made the announcement last week at the district level that there would be an acquisition of 50,000 primarily funded by Comcast. Today, the 76ers announced another 10,000 devices. And then on the charter side specifically, we're working on acquiring potentially another 20,000 devices to distribute across charter schools to support their learning. The biggest piece, though, I think still is not necessarily the device, but access to the internet itself. And so that's something that we're continuing to think about. It helps to have Comcast here in our backyard. I think they've been strong partners in this, and I'm optimistic that we can make sure that students and families are connected.
Tess, have you all had any experience with this so far?
Not thus far. I think what I'm focused on right now is that as the state is able to get access to any funds from a federal level, making sure that those could be available to districts and charter schools alike. And so really focused on when the Tennessee Department of Education puts out any sort of application or guidance, that we're ensuring that those might be accessible to our charter partners as well as our traditional district partners.
Cool, great. Jason? You're on mute, Jason. Oh, try it again. We can't hear you. All right. So hopefully we don't have a technical issue there, but we'll move on to another question. Jerry in Missouri, University of Missouri, asked the question, what role would local assessments play since state testing is off the table in most states? So are any of you considering adding or, well, using local assessments at a school level to give you some perspective on the academic performance of schools through the end of this school year? Tess,
I'm happy to take that first. We will not be including any local assessments formally in our performance framework. However, we will be looking towards internal school data when it comes to both our end of year meeting, which typically happens over the summer for us with our individual schools, where we typically are using state assessment data to drive that conversation, but we will be asking the schools to provide as most up-to-date as possible their internal assessment data for us to discuss. Again, it won't be an accountability purpose for ours, but more just how they're using that data to plan for the school year. I also think that we'll be asking the question, you know, we can't hold them accountable, we'll be asking the question, what sort of local assessments are you planning to use when school does get started again, either at the end of this school year, hopefully, or at the beginning of the next school year, to really assess where your students are. You know, that will be at the discretion of our schools of what that looks like, but I think that is going to have to be a key driver in our schools' plans. So we'll want to hear their feedback on that question.
Okay.
Hey, Dave, can you hear me? This is Jason.
I can.
Okay. Two things. One, as I mentioned earlier, that we heavily rely on the NWEA map. We've discontinued that this year. So that's the only, we wouldn't even consider that a local assessment, but we don't use local assessments for of our assessment purposes and do not plan on doing so. Now this gets to potentially next week's session on adjusting performance frameworks, which we'll obviously need to do in the short and potentially long term to account for all of this. But I also wanted to quickly weigh in on the previous question when I was muted, but we are hopeful but not terribly optimistic that there'll be funds available to support distance learning initiatives. As I mentioned, the state has issued some flexibility on title funds, which I'm sure they got approval federally to do. Now that doesn't, it's not necessarily a game changer, but it might help a little bit in terms of being able to provide devices and hotspots potentially using those funds. And we are contemplating to what extent we can leverage our own resources to support schools that might have needs on an individual or portfolio-wide basis around distance learning, but are in the beginning stages of evaluating that, again, pending any kind of updates from the state.
Okay. Peng?
Yeah, the short answer is no. The lack of consistency between schools and the type of assessments they may administer just really makes it hard for us to use them. And so unless a school in their specific contract has local assessments built in, we're not going to take a look at them.
Got it. There's a question from Angela Alvarez in Baltimore, and this kind of goes to what Jason was just talking about. So this conversation, in kind of prepping for this and hearing this again, we've realized that all of you, many of you are already anticipating going into the fall for renewal decisions, right? So in the absence of state assessments, all of you have presumably performance frameworks attached to your contracts that identify the need and the reliance on state assessments. So what we're going to do is that right now we're looking at oversight today. Next Monday, we will have a session just like this. We'll invite all of you, and we'll be talking about very specifically how authorizers are adjusting their renewal expectations and their evidence base in the absence of state assessments. Just as a teaser, I mean, aside from, yes, we're worried about that, have any of you started to address that question?
So Dave, I would say we have not specifically on renewal simply because we don't have any coming up. I think for me, the biggest concern I have is how are we going to be reviewing charter applications of existing operators that are going to be coming up for, I know, districts in our state very quickly. So I would put a plug that if you could potentially think about either next Monday, including those in the charter application review or having another session, because I know for us, existing operator data is a critical piece of our puzzle. And in Tennessee, we have had several years of on and off data, which has really hampered how authorizers look at applications just generally. And so for us, the more pressing issue is around that application review. So we're just lucky we don't have renewals coming up in the next year.
Great.
Dave, this is Jason. I think Tess brings up a really important consideration, especially for those of you that are in expanding markets that have more replication going on. And I hadn't thought about that as much until she had mentioned that around the replicating kind of piece and the need for data. We absolutely have been digging in over the last couple of weeks, communicating with our schools, reassuring them that we'll be all working in good faith to make full assessments with the data that we do have, and working on kind of plans to adjust that for a whole kind of cohort of schools up for renewal, but then also on some individual circumstances. So can be happy to share a little bit more next week on that piece.
Great. Peng?
Yeah, the renewal question is going to be huge for us. It's not just a next year's cohort issue for us. I think it's going to have impacts for many cohorts to come, and just accountability as we know it. Pennsylvania Charter School Law does allow Philadelphia to offer 1-year renewals in the event that we don't have sufficient data to make a decision. And so for the dozen or so schools that we have in next year's cohort, it's pretty likely that we'll kind of start with a 1-year renewal for them and then see if we can figure something out in the subsequent year.
All right, thank you. Just to clarify, there's a question about Sarsfield. Sarsfield is representing Central Michigan University. So there's just a side question about that. An additional question from Brittany in Memphis. She's kind of the nuance of language and setting expectations. So how are you all framing information that you're not requiring as mandatory, even if it's, or you're requiring it as expectation, even though it's not mandatory? So for instance, you want information about their online plans and how they're moving to distance learning. It's not explicitly spelled out in your contract, right, as an expectation. State law or state Department of Ed may be saying these things have to happen, but how are you kind of threading that needle of like, we really need to know these things and we're going to hold you accountable to it, even though it's not articulated in our contract. Peng, maybe you can start with that.
Yeah. Sometimes even though we might not have the full kind of comprehensive legal backing, we are saying that this is a required submission. I think overwhelmingly schools understand why it's required, why it's in many cases mutually beneficial, so that they can get the feedback and we can understand what all is happening. And we've developed kind of relationships at the state level such that they're willing to support us with a lot of these continuity of education plan requirements. And frankly, I think if we get to the point, because of the context of the crisis that we're all working through right now, if we end up with a school or schools that really are pushing back against us, we're going to make it known that they feel like it's unreasonable for them to have to share a plan with their authorizer or with the public in accordance with new state statute. And I think that's something that a step that we don't anticipate that we will have to take, but it's not off the table if we have to get to that point.
Okay. Tess?
Sure. So what we went out with first was probably similar to Peng. It was a very brief email saying we just need general bullets. Like we just need to know what is happening beyond kind of what we're able to see via their Facebook page. What we're then telling them is that, the follow-up question is, if any of this is required, that's when we're going to start talking about what your actual requirements are and your compliance requirements are. And so for us, it's more, we want to let them know what their threshold is with regard to legal requirements, right, in this world that we're living in right now, as opposed to we're going to be holding you accountable to the packets that you're sending home every day. We want to say, if you're going to send home packets, have you translated them? How are you supporting students with disabilities? So really asking them those critical questions, not from a oversight role, but more, are they thinking through backup plans A, B, and C? And if they are going to be holding any official instruction, then here is the guidance that they need to understand about when they meet that threshold, what their compliance requirements are.
Okay. Jason, anything to add?
No, we haven't really had issues in the same spirit, I think, as Peng had illustrated, which I think folks generally get, that it's not a gotcha. And there's been some pretty good spirited collaboration in that regard. At the end of the day, however, our charter contract is written in such a way that we can really request and require anything that's relevant to the school at any point in time. And we don't like to throw that out there and be heavy-handed, but I just don't see a lot of challenge in getting the things that we might need to both oversee and support the schools.
Yeah. I mean, we always say relationships matter. And so like if, back to our original conversation about supports, like if you're doing some things to help them, like they likely will kind of accommodate expectations, to some nuanced changed expectations or requirements with things. I have another question that may be our last one to pose, but it's something that we haven't really spoken about. I'm kind of rephrasing it, but SEL supports. So like we're talking about compliance, finances, like academic outcomes, students who are at risk, or even just like, middle school students have high needs, right? And they rely on all of the supports to the whole student that these schools provide. Have any of you entered into any conversations, or have you experienced any schools that are effectively leveraging technology or other ways to help those students in the absence of physically being able to sit down with them? Peng?
Yeah, we have, I think a lot of our schools are thinking about it because a lot of our schools have to think about it. And so that's a good step one. There are some schools that have shared their plan with us and the rest of the sector around how they still kind of do group meetings with students and their peers, just like they had them, for the first half of the year. There are some schools talking to their contractors about how they can update the terms to make sure that it covers, distance support and remote support. I think those conversations are going well. Again, no one's ever done it before, so it might not neatly fit into a plan that's in place for a student, and so those are going to have to be updated ever so slightly, if not just for the context or the manner that the support is being delivered. But I think schools are talking to each other about it, which is great, and they're sharing them with us so that we can connect them to other schools that are also doing the same supports.
All right, Jason, then Tess.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
SEL supports, like how schools are able to fulfill their support to students that are like non-academic, but thinking of the whole student. Have you experienced any of that, or any schools that are leveraging technology to effectively help the students?
Yeah, I missed the question the first time around because in the absence of my camera, I'm multitasking and I just got caught. But that said, there's a number of our schools that I think are doing a really nice job in this regard, electronically, of course, connecting students and not around, instruction, but around, social emotional well-being, and not just individually, but in small and large groups. But I would really say that those are anecdotes at the individual school level. We have not provided any real specific guidance or support on this piece, but I would anticipate that there'll probably be something in the state's requirements in terms of learning continuity around social emotional learning, and I think it's really easy to forget about. But as we all know, all students are at risk right now, and particularly in the social emotional realm. And this is an area I think that it can easily be overlooked, but it is critically important in the short and long term. So thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah. Tess, anything to add?
No, and I see that there was a clarification on the question is specifically around safety. And I think for us, our priority last week, which is the first week that schools in Tennessee were officially closed, was access to food and other basic needs. So really making sure that our schools had a plan, what their plan was, how they needed support, if any, from us, and really connecting them with the resources from the State Department of Education. So kind of just making sure students' primary needs were being met. And now I think as we're moving into week 2 here in Tennessee, we're seeing schools who are branching out to move the social emotional needs via a Google Classroom or a Facebook Live, really just engaging with their students. I know as a parent, I have 2 kindergartners who are running around downstairs. I would welcome some access to teachers in the way that I'm seeing some of our charter schools are being able to leverage technology. And so I think we're seeing some real innovations that I hope continue as the closures continue as well.
That's great. A couple of things before we wrap up. So if you just stay on for a second, there are a couple things. One, I just want to say thank you to the panelists for kind of sticking their necks out and admitting that they haven't got it all figured out. I think that's one of the biggest lessons that I think I've heard on a daily basis is everybody's just trying to get this right. That's why we wanted to leverage this and to kind of get everybody to hear each other and pose and respond to some of these questions. So thank you. Next week at this time, we'll set the time and we'll send an invite out to everybody through the same means that we did before, but feel free to share it with others. We're going to focus on renewal and some of these adjustments that we spoke on briefly, but to hear how some of your offices and colleagues are adjusting your renewal frameworks in the absence of state assessment data. There's a survey that'll be available to you as you move forward, or that as we come out of this Zoom call. So please, we would like any feedback that you're able to offer. And just thank you for taking the time. If you have any specific questions that you have for me, or if you don't have the contact information for the 3 panelists and you'd like to pose a question but you can't find their information, feel free to filter it through me or Jen Strock, my colleague. Please just give us ideas if there's an additional question or idea that you all have regarding other topics that you think could be useful for this environment that you all could share out with each other. We're more than happy to facilitate those conversations if a number of people want to do it. Tess, Peng, Jason, anything to add before we sign off?
Thank you all. We're all in this together, so we don't have all the answers, and we look forward to hearing your great thoughts as well.
All right. Thanks everybody for your time and good luck as we move forward. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.